Hello and welcome to The Record. The headlines. As the Work and Pensions Secretary resigns, Tony Blair tells the Commons David Blunkett has left with no stain of impropriety. The government's majority is cut to just one over parts of its anti-terror bill. Later, ministers say they're willing to compromise over plans to detain terror suspects without charge for 90 days after MPs attack the proposal.
So this is a matter of whether we detain somebody without trial, without charge, for 3 months. That is not the British way of doing things.
And officials deny the Princess Diana Memorial Fountain is a drippy disaster. But first, outside the Commons, David Blunkett apologised for any embarrassment he'd caused the Prime Minister after resigning over a breach of the ministerial code. Inside Parliament, Tony Blair was explaining to MPs why the former Work and Pensions Secretary had gone. It's the second time Mr Blunkett has been forced to leave government in less than 12 months. He'd been under sustained pressure after breaking the code by taking jobs in business without consulting a special committee.
The House will know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, has resigned. I would like to say that whatever mistakes my right honourable friend has made, I've always believed and believe now that he's a decent and honourable man who has contributed a great deal to his country, who has overcome immense challenges that frankly would have daunted the rest of us, and he can be proud of his record in British public life.
This has been an extraordinary week for the government and for the Prime Minister. We have seen the slow seepage of his authority turn into a hemorrhage. We all acknowledge the honourable way in which the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions has decided to resign, and I pay tribute to him for that. But the key question now is for the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister think that in his handling of this affair, his judgment has been at fault in any way?
Well, let me tell him exactly why I did not believe that the allegations made against my right honourable friend warranted his dismissal. And perhaps with the frenzy that is going on around this, it's just as well for the House and for members of the public just to explain why not. There were basically 3 sets of allegations, and perhaps I can just be allowed to detail my reasons why I decided not to dismiss them. There were 3 sets of allegations. One was that he had not sought the advice of the Independent Advisory Committee, which he should have done. That is a breach of the ministerial code, it is true. I did not believe that it warranted dismissal for these reasons. First of all, I could discover no impropriety or wrongdoing in his doing that. Secondly, he had actually registered these things. He had registered these jobs with the Register of Members' Interests. It arose out of a misunderstanding on the correspondence, which I looked at myself and believed was an honest misunderstanding on his part, and it was clear to me that even had he been in touch with the advisory committee, as he accepts he should have done, the most that would have happened is that in respect of one of those jobs, his taking up of that job would have been delayed by a few weeks. In those circumstances, I did not believe it warranted his dismissal. The second set of allegations was in respect of the register of shareholdings in DNA Bioscience. He was supposed to follow a particular procedure for ministers when they come into government. He followed that procedure completely. Therefore, I could find no breach of the ministerial code in respect of that. The third and most serious allegations that were made by the shadow leader of the House was that he had had discussions whilst a member of the government and made representations on behalf of this firm that was either had a contract or was trying to get a contract from the Department of Work and Pensions. Had that allegation been true, it most certainly would have been a dismissible offence. I looked into that allegation. I found it to be completely untrue, and therefore it would not have been right in these circumstances for him to resign. That is why I did not dismiss him under the ministerial code.
Well, the Secretary of State has resigned, and I don't intend to pursue those matters this afternoon. And I quite understand why the Prime Minister's judgment in these last few days has been awry. I can entirely sympathise with his desire to cling on to the right honourable gentleman, the member for Sheffield Brightside. Isn't it a fact that he was one of the Prime Minister's last remaining allies in the Cabinet.
My right honourable friend resigned for the reasons that he gave, that it became impossible for him, frankly, with the frenzy surrounding him and his job, for him to carry on doing that job properly. The reason I outlined to him the specific allegations is that I think, in fairness to him, people should understand that a lot of what has been written about him in the past few days has, on my investigation of the facts, turned out to be completely untrue. However, having said that, for the reasons that he's given, he has resigned. But I would just simply put to the House, that sometimes in these occasions, the degree of pressure to which people are subject is absolutely extraordinary. And I think we should just occasionally reflect on that. And when it's from somebody that has done an immense amount for this country, I think as he goes from government, we should say he goes, in my view, with no stain of impropriety against him whatever.
If the Prime Minister recalled some of the words he'd used when he was in opposition, he might have found it rather difficult to repeat the words he's just uttered today.
Well, Michael Howard continued to suggest that David Blunkett's resignation left the Prime Minister isolated. The Liberal Democrat leader took a different approach.
Does he agree that it does surely seem rather absurd that a minister or an ex-minister is obliged to seek advice, but is not actually obliged then to take that advice? As a result of this experience, is the Prime Minister and with him the Cabinet Secretary actually urgently addressing that issue?
I think it's now pretty clear, if it wasn't before, that ministers are expected, when they leave office, to take the advice of the Independent Advisory Committee. And obviously that's got to be made clear. It certainly is fairly clear now, I would say.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is ignoring the fact that they can seek advice and then not take advice. That is a ridiculous state of affairs for an apparent ministerial code of conduct. But can I ask the Prime Minister a further question? It was well reported recently, Mr. Speaker, that the now former Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions and the Prime Minister disagreed over incapacity benefit reform. Can we have an assurance, whoever is going to occupy this Office of State later today, that the number 10 machine will not seek to impose their will on that Secretary of State where the reform of incapacity benefit is concerned? Because that is what people out there actually care about.
Well, again, when we actually get back to policy, let me just tell the right honourable gentleman, the Liberal Democrats now oppose every single reform, whether in the public services or for welfare. It is absurd to say that incapacity benefit, that is now costing £13 billion a year, where we've got 3 million people economically inactive in this country, doesn't need reform. It does need reform. This side has got the courage to do it, and as ever, when it comes to a policy decision, the Liberal Democrats lack that courage.
Tony Blair. And things didn't get any better for the Prime Minister. The government's majority was cut to just one when MPs debated the section of the terrorism bill dealing with the glorification of terrorism. It's the closest Tony Blair has come to defeat in the Commons since Labour came to power in 1997. Opponents say the offence is too broad and would catch people who are simply campaigning against overseas regimes. During the debate, there were many examples of the possible impact of the bill.
A teacher or tutor distributing terrorist propaganda to a class studying history in the Middle East. Caught under the Act without a shadow of doubt.
When he started his contribution, he said that the old-fashioned offence of incitement would cover really what's necessary in this particular field. He may have heard earlier on today I mentioned there were 700 new criminal offences brought onto the statute book by this government. This surely has to stop, and I agree in every way with what he's saying now. He is a learned man who knows the way these things work. This is an absolute nonsense.
We all know, and that's what the Home Secretary says in his inimitable way, of course it's not going to be enforced. That's what he means. Well, we can't pass legislation. We can't pass legislation like that. He has a charming way of dealing in public debate with this kind of thing. When you point out to him that this would be criminalised, undoubtedly under the Act, he has a charming way of dealing with it. He said, no, it won't. And that's it. All right, the ex cathedra statement, oh, no, wrong about that, and pass on to the next prosecution. Sir Allen, yes, I will, and but other members must speak. So.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, because he and my honourable friend have made a very forceful argument. But the fact is that we are all aware that over the last few years there have been some seriously inflammatory statements that have been made, and I single out people like Omar Bakri Mohammed and others. And I've been complaining about this. His honourable friend for Hendon's been complaining for years about this. And every time that I've raised it, including with the current Foreign Secretary, then the Home Secretary, say, why is no action being taken against these people? Well, we've always been told that there's insufficient evidence or there's insufficient laws on the statute book to be able to deal with it.
I mean, frankly, as things stand at the moment, with the clause at present, it seems to me that the glorification of Robin Hood would be likely to be caught by the operation of this statute.
Thing is a complete red herring, because what my reading of this is to say is, if you stand up in front of an audience and say the suicide bombers are wonderful and you should go and do the same thing, and that is what this is about.
Emulate.
It's glorification and emulation.
Exactly.
If I may say to the honourable lady, I understand her point, but her point is covered by the first part of the bill, which we've just discussed.
It is crazy if we land ourselves in a situation where we gag society from calling for pledging their support and calling for international support for those in domestic struggles who seek to free themselves from tyrannical regimes.
Would the honourable gentleman agree that there is a curious paradox here? On the one hand, it appears to be the case that it's proper for governments to wage war in order to procure regime change in Iraq. Whereas if we recommended that the citizens of Iraq should have risen up in order to destroy Saddam Hussein, they could be prosecuted in this country for doing that.
Of course, it's invidious, I think, for ministers to stand at the dispatch box and say what would be criminal and what wouldn't. It's a matter for the courts to decide. But there are very serious concerns about whether or not people can actually say, wasn't it fantastic what happened on the 7th of July, knowing or believing that the effect on the people to whom they're speaking is for them to be encouraged to emulate that behaviour. I think that's the kind of territory that we're in, and I think that's a very serious matter indeed. And some of the fanciful suggestions, I have to say, that we've heard don't help us take this argument any further.
Hazel Blairs, but when it came to the vote, things couldn't have been closer.
The ayes to the right, 299. The noes to the left, 300.
Order. The ayes to the right, 299. The noes to the left, 300. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock.
Well, after all that, the Home Secretary, Charles Clarke, signalled he was prepared to climb down on another controversial part of the bill. His plans to hold terror suspects for 90 days without charge. He told the House of Commons that to reach a consensus, he'd hold urgent discussions about a lower figure, though it would be more than the present 14 days. He hopes a new limit can be agreed before the terrorism bill comes back to the Commons next week. Well, at the start of the debate, it was clear the original proposal to hold people for 90 days was facing very stiff opposition.
What is proposed by the government with 14 days was already, the present position is already at the outer limit of what is practised elsewhere. The move to 3 months takes us entirely outside accepted international practice. And the point has been well made, and I think has to be remembered by members of this House, that of the people arrested until September 2005, under the previous terrorism legislation, out of 895 people arrested, only 23 have been charged.
The government constantly repeats the excuse that the police want more powers. But will you agree with me that the police always want more powers? That is our institutional bias. But normally, the issue is not more legislation and more procedures, but better use of existing legislation and existing procedures.
The position is that I'm sure the police should be listened to very carefully. But this House and the government should not give the police a blank cheque.
The honourable gentleman knows that it's not just for questioning, it's to obtain evidence, or it says in the bill, or otherwise. He made reference earlier to a blank cheque. Now, it's not a blank cheque, as he well knows, it's 90 days. How would he feel as a legislator? And in his own words, 40, 50 or 60 days without any evidence being found, somebody is released and then actually kills tens of and dozens of people.
Would not my honourable friend agree that there is no logic between 90 days, according to the honourable gentleman, that would not apply to 120 days and 360 days?
Or permanent.
Or permanent.
That's what everyone...
And secondly, is it not true that if those 850 people who were released after 14 days, might be unhappy about the inconvenience, they would be considerably more unhappy were they in prison for 60 or 70 days. And the effect, as he rightly says, on community relations would be very severe indeed.
I have had many representations from members of the Muslim community against the proposals, because these proposals will disproportionately affect members of the Muslim community and members of the Asian community.
A Labour MP had put down a compromise amendment that suspects could be held for 28 days.
I do say myself that 90 days, an increase, this is what is being suggested in the clause, a direct increase from 14 days to 90 days is not justified. And I've heard no justification except, as has already been pointed out, the Home Secretary telling us that the police happen to be of that view. And I don't believe that's sufficient.
Some of us are struggling, whilst we look at the evidence and know that the 90-day is something of one based on some evidence that the police have put forward. We're struggling to see why the 28 days is somehow scientifically accurate, and the worry of many members is if we set it at 28 days and say that is it based on discussions in the House today, then that does not give the flexibility to the police and the intelligence services to do what they need to do.
This is not a trivial matter. This is a very, very important matter. This is a matter of whether we detain somebody without trial, without charge, for 3 months. That is not the British way of doing things. That is not the way we carry out our judicial processes in this country. So if we allow that, then we have allowed at least a partial victory for the terrorists. Let's be clear about that. And it does bring into question some old-fashioned concepts which I believe are still important, and I'm happy to know that there are other members in this House who still believe are important, such as liberty, such as justice, such as the rights of the citizen, whoever they may be, to a proper hearing before the law.
Well, after all that, Charles Clarke set out the compromise he was willing to make.
My view is that the issues should be resolved in this House, and my proposal, which I would ask my honourable friend for Walsall North to accept if he was ready to, is that we engage in urgent discussions with colleagues on all sides of the House to see if we can reach consensus on a figure beyond 14 days. On that basis, we would bring forward a government amendment for report stage containing whatever that agreed figure was. Of course, if we couldn't reach agreement, the amendments which are now in front of the House can also be tabled at report for debate at that time, and that can happen. But I honestly believe that in this trade-off between the protections and safeguards I described and the length of time, it is beneficial to have genuine discussion across the House about these things. I do that in a spirit of flexibility and openness to try and achieve it. I also believe, quite frankly, that we would all as members benefit from another week to discuss with our constituents, our local polices, if that's right, our local community organisations, the mosques in a given constituency, whatever it might be, what they think about these issues. And I think we'd do our job better as a Parliament if those discussions took place.
Charles Clarke. Now, officials behind the controversial Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fountain have denied the project was a fiasco. The monument in Hyde Park has faced problems since it was opened by the Queen 16 months ago, including blocked pumps and waterlogged grass. It was closed 2 weeks later after some visitors fell over whilst having a paddle. Earlier this year, it was closed again for 4 months for renovation. MPs on the Public Accounts Committee heard the cost of the memorial had risen from £3 million to £5.2 million. The chairman, Edward Lee, demanded an explanation for the problems.
Why, within 2 or 3 weeks of this fountain opening, did it look like a complete bog and just an open drain outside Heathrow Airport? I'm addressing my remarks, Mr. Camley.
Two things happened. First, we hadn't anticipated quite how many people were going to come and use the memorial, or in the way in which they did actually end up using it. And secondly, there was a major storm the day after it opened, and that, along with the amount of people who were using the fountain, actually led to wet and slippy grass.
You couldn't, with all these people involved, were you adequately consulted in the Parks Administration? It's well known, isn't it, that anybody walking their dog around there would know that area is a bog anyway. Could nobody have foreseen that fragile grass next to a water feature with hundreds, even hundreds, let alone thousands of people, would reduce it to a muddy bog within days, which is what happened?
In terms of the planning of the fountain itself, something in the region of 1,000 tonnes of sand and topsoil was put into that area, recognising that it had previously been a marshy area, and somewhere in the region of over a mile of drainage pipes were also put into the area.
£700,000 have had to be pumped into it this year, haven't they, to make good all this lack of planning? That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Would you accept that the way the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fountain has been, the plans have been executed and the problems, once opened, could be described as a fiasco?
There certainly were tough lessons to learn about a stricter project management discipline, and we have taken those to heart with all subsequent projects. I don't think it can be described as a fiasco because since May, after the teething troubles, very, very severe troubles had been put right, we've had over 600,000 visitors to the memorial. It's obviously enormously popular. There were 16,000 on the anniversary of the Princess's death. There have been 4 accidents in the whole of that time, compared to at the beginning when I'm absolutely open with the committee, we were overwhelmed with the numbers of visitors in the first few days. So I think it's been a troubled project with a good and lasting outcome and some tough lessons learnt along the way.
And time for a look back at our top story. David Blunkett resigns from the Cabinet for the second time in 12 months. The Work and Pensions Secretary left the government after breaking the ministerial code. But Tony Blair tells MPs there's no stain of impropriety.
Hello there, good morning. For many of us, it's going to be a wet and a windy day, especially across western Britain. Now, the strongest of the winds will tend to be towards the southwest. Here, there could be 60 mile-per-hour gusts inland, perhaps around 75 miles per hour along the coasts. Strong winds too into parts of Wales. Here, though, the focus will probably be the rain. We've got some heavy rain to come. Some of that rain edging in towards Northern Ireland, but here the winds should be lighter. Lighter winds too across Scotland, but looking pretty wet across central and southern Scotland, so a nasty rush hour here. North East England should escape with a little bit of sunshine perhaps first thing, but it will be a brief respite. We will see rain moving in later on, and the rain will move too in towards the southeast and East Anglia, and the winds strengthening here. So a very wet and windy day, especially towards the south and the west. Now, through the day, most of us will catch a shower, if not more persistent spells of rain, and the winds still very strong across southern areas. Temperatures may reach 16 or 17, but it will feel much cooler. Now, the rain and the winds do tend to sweep northwards through Friday, so wetter and windier across Scotland, in particular, a little bit brighter perhaps further south, but hold on to the brightness because through Saturday we see the cloud thickening up from the west and the rain moving in, so yet again things turning wet and windy for the weekend. Looking very wet indeed across England and Wales through Sunday, a little bit drier and brighter further north. Bye-bye.
This year, for children in need, be what you want to be. For your free fundraising pack, call 0845 607 3333. Go on, you might surprise yourself.
What Howard would or would not like is beginning to irritate me.
We shall take control of the tomb.
Egypt. The search continues Sunday at 9 on BBC One.
Violence in Paris suburbs for a seventh night, despite government efforts to tackle the problem. Allegations that the CIA has a network of secret detention facilities around the world for terrorist suspects. Iraq's defense ministry calls on former officers who served under Saddam Hussein to rejoin the military. And saying farewell to a civil rights pioneer, America pays its respects to Rosa Parks. And thanks for choosing BBC News. I'm Alistair Yates. Sporadic acts of violence have continued in some suburbs of Paris for a seventh evening, despite government efforts to tackle the problem. Most trouble seems to have been confined to the large Seine-Saint-Denis area to the northeast of the French capital, where disturbances first started last week. Roaming gangs set fire to cars. Earlier, senior French ministers held a crisis meeting on the rioting.
Parked up and awaiting the call. The French riot police tonight gathered in large numbers, one half of a confrontation that has lasted a week and is being watched by the whole country. It has been like this night after night. The charges and stun grenades of heavily armed police, the violence and flames of young protesters. A Paris that is rarely seen, lit up last night by more than 100 fires. The unrest began because of the deaths of two teenagers, but it has continued for other issues, like life in these poor areas and the way people here feel they are treated. France is now unsettled, and so is its government. Today, a special cabinet meeting. Now, this man, Nicolas Sarkozy, is blamed by some for fueling the unrest with his tough law.